also questions for the audience. So I hope it will be more interactive kind of talk. And Sato Pele. First of all, Sat Sri Akal, Namaskar, Assalamu Alaikum, good evening, bonsoir. I'm Elaine, pleased to welcome you. And thank you very much, Professor Murphy, for inviting me to this beautiful place and to share some music. I would like to begin with music, actually. The Tumri in Rag Kamaj. Itni araj mori manle. It's a request. Araj is a request. And this is my request to you to pay attention to the voices of women who a long time ago sang in music halls of royal courts like this one in Varanasi on the banks of the Ganges, in music salons, in the kotas, in the female quarters of the palaces, the Zanankana, in the Hindu temples, in the mandir, in the gurudwaras, in the Sufi gatherings. Mehfils in which women did partake, sometimes in silence, just watching, sometimes involved in dance and music activities. This evening I will take you into a journey to a lesser-known history of South Asian music, the private and the public sphere of women's musical activities. These are two sides of the same coin, opposite aspects that can be fully understood only when in relationship, one to the other. This picture well summarizes these two oppositions, these two different poles, the private and the public sphere. And I have a question here for you. What do you notice in this photograph? It's a very rich photograph.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, can you hear me? Or I think I will use the microphone. I feel more comfortable with that. And I will repeat the question. The question is that this picture summarizes these two different aspects, the private and the public sphere of life, women's life. And my question is, what do you notice in this photograph? This photograph, I took this photograph actually, it's a courtesy of the British Library. What do you notice?
There are people upstairs.
There are people upstairs, and those people are women. They have a double parda. They have the veil, they have the chuni, and then there's another parda, the cheek, these very thin bamboos, curtains. So the cheeks are very special, and they are used so that you can actually see from inside, but not seeing from outside. So that is one private level. Women from the royal families were actually used to sit without being seen, and they watch the world outside. What is happening downstairs? What do you notice downstairs? There are Nachnis, dancers,
like
young girls.
Like in the kotas, like they dance.
The kotas are the courtesan salons.
Yeah.
This is a court.
Okay, so.
And you have the young women dancing, accompanied by musicians. It's also very interesting for history of music that the tabla player, is not sitting, he's standing. He's holding the tabla, the instrument. The tabla were much lighter, were made of, the bayan was made actually of clay, not of wood, so it was much lighter. So that they would stand with the musicians. So that is the stage, was the opposite. The musicians were standing and the audience was sitting. And what about the audience? Your old man. So I think this picture is quite interesting from different aspects. And I would like to begin discussing the life within the female quarters of the royal palaces and those places of rich families and noble families. Female members of noble families lived in dedicated areas of the palace, the so-called Zanankana, with their children and maids. The Zanankana was a protected area where only the ruler or the head of the family had access, no other men. Some Maharaja, some ruler, had more than one wife and several concubines, all living in this dedicated section of the palace. So it was a very rich life. In the Zanankana, women had a life of their own, separated from the rest of the world, outside the world of the walls of the palace. This is a very, very famous Hava Mahal in Jaipur. One of the examples. The Zanankana is huge, with many, many apartments and rooms for the noble women and for their maids. Women could, as I said, watch standing behind the jali, the marble grill, without being seen. In the Telangana, women shared their own songs, but they were not allowed to perform music in public events, like in this picture. Especially for audiences that included men not belonging to the family. Thus, although iconographic sources like this one are evidence of musical activities within the Zanankana, we have very little information on the private female repertoires, as women's dances and songs were considered peripheral, not relevant to the history of Indian music, and thus forgettable. I would like to mention an exception, the work done by the late Rajmata Govardhan of Kishangarh in Rajasthan, a Gujarati Rajasthani princess who died in 2013, and I had the great honor to interview her and do some little work with her. She dedicated her efforts to revive those repertoires performed within the royal families by women from the royal families for a female audience. And along with her disciple Pratibha Naitani, she wrote a book on Rajavari Geet, the music performed, not folk music, but the music performed by the female from the royal family. But otherwise very little is known about this music. So we have our iconographic sources like this one, or this other picture that a miniature. I took a picture from, with the permission of Kala Bhavan in Benares. So we see that there was an activity, but actually we don't know what they were singing. Music is lost, and there are no accounts. There are no names of relevant female musicians. And so the extraordinary documentation that Rajmata Govardhan has done addresses some important facts. First of all, there is a paucity of historical and musicological accounts on female repertoires, both in the private and public sphere, the folk repertoires, the religious repertoires, or even the repertoires in the classical realms. And there are two reasons for that. On the one hand, women's musical activities were considered peripheral to the mainstream forms, which were public and dominated by male musicians. But also I would like to address another important fact. Musical accounts have always been written by male writers. In Persian, in Sanskrit, if you think about Sharnagadeva, if you think about Fakirullah, these are all men. It means that they did not have access in the female quarters, or they didn't have interest in describing this music. They did not consider this music, these musical practices relevant. Could be both ways. Until post-colonial era, also ethnomusicological scholarship was male-oriented, and research on female musical activities sparkled only in the 1980s with the so-called second feminist wave. I'm not going to talk about the three different feminist waves. I can only speak about my research and my personal experience today. I started my studies and fieldwork in the early 1990s, willing to learn more about that other unspoken side of Indian music, trying to figure out why the term guru, teacher, was applied to male teachers only, or why that of the ragi, the knowers of ragas in Sikh culture, was still a gender role. I lived for several years in India, where I was trained in vocal music by one of the legendary singers of the tradition, Padma Bhushan Sardarni Fainuddin Khan Daga. My teacher was a Muslim and a master of Drupad, a genre of Indian classical music that was transmitted for centuries, only in male lineages. I often asked my teacher why, in all of Indian music history, there were no female performers of this genre, or why, if any, their names were not remembered, not acknowledged. In the long discussions with my teacher, he would often mention that it depended on the diverse nature of the female and the male body and how, according to the yoga system, energy moves differently in men and women. And so, why was I allowed to learn a repertoire that has always been a male form of sung poetry? On the one hand, the performance of Drupad compositions entails an aesthetic and a technique of singing that hardly suits the female voice. I will play a brief excerpt from one of my teacher's recording to give you a practical example of what I mean. They did not recommend women to sing the mass. They said it would affect the uterus. Could be true. Maybe more a cultural reason. I see someone shaking the head. So interestingly though, most medieval songs, Drupad is medieval music, set to medieval poetry. So most of medieval songs, including Drupad compositions, speak, however, with a feminine voice. So my question was, why could this text not be rendered by a female voice? If the songs have a female, the poetry is written from the female standpoint, why women were not allowed to sing publicly? I'm talking about the public sphere, not the private here. Or did exist a form of, or a genre, or a form of music that suited a female aesthetics, a female voice? With these questions in mind, in 2005, I published an extensive essay on this topic with the aim of unveiling the history of female music makers in pre-partition India, investigating the repertoires suitable to female voices, songs that possibly carried a female aesthetics. When I began my research, the only name of a female singer that I could find in Indian music books was Mirabai, the medieval saint and poetess. Mirabai was born in Rajasthan in 1498 from a Rajput family. Since her childhood, she was a fervent devotee of Krishna, a deity of the Hindu pantheon. A central figure in the Bhakti movement, Krishna is seen as the beloved. Krishna's lover, his counterpart, Radha, symbolically represents the mankind bounded in a love relationship with the divine. The medieval Bhakti movement was based on a form of personal devotion to the deity that transcended the existing caste system. Famous Bhakti saints of the 13th, 16th centuries were Ravidas, for instance, Tulsidas, Nandev, Kabir, all from low classes. So within this context, Mirabai stood out, not only for belonging to a noble family, but also for breaking a gender norm, being the first female saint, poet, and musician of her time. At the age of 18, she was forced to marry Bhojraj, the prince of Mevar. It was an unhappy relationship, as Mirabai felt she was already married to Krishna, and she wished to devote herself to the deity. 3 years after the wedding, her husband passed away, and it was the custom of the time for high caste Rajput widows to join the deceased on the funeral pyre, the sati, doing sati. Mirabai refused and rather sought, in her new status of widow, the possibility of overcoming caste and gender barriers to freely express herself in her devotion to Krishna. She began performing her songs in praise of Krishna in public, in temples, joining gatherings of many mystics. While on the one hand, this helped to spread her songs within the Bhakti community, at the same time, her unconventional behavior was labeled as a madness, and her reputation worried her in-laws. Eventually, in 1527, Mirabai left the sheltered life at the royal palace of Chittor to travel to religious places where her songs became very popular and transmitted orally. The folklore narrates that Mirabai died in 1546, becoming one with the image of Krishna in a temple in Dwarka and perhaps singing a song like this one. Aliri mere nayan van pari, chittachari mere madhuri murat urabich an pari. Kab ki tari pant niharam apne bhavan kari, kaise pran piya bin rakhu जीवन मूल जरी मीरा के प्रभु गिरधर नागर लोग कहे बड़ी अलीरी मेरे नैन बान परी. We don't have the music actually composed by Mirabai. We have the text as transmitted orally and later in written form. But one of my teachers, Girija Devi, has set this text to Rag Bhairavi. Here it is. Kab ki tani pant nihar, kab ki tani pant nihar, apne pavan apne bhavan khari nayan bhav pari nayan bhav pari kaise pran piya bin rakhun kaise pran kaise pran kaise pran piya bin rakhun जीवन मोल जाए जीवन मोल जाए नयन भान पड़ी नयन भान पड़ी मीरा के प्रभु गिरिधर नागर गिरिधर नागर गिरिधर नागर मीरा के प्रभु गिरिधर नागर मीरा के प्रभु गिरिधर नागर गिरिधर नागर मीरा के प्रभु गिरिधर नागर लोभ काहे बिगाड़ी लोभ काहे नयन बान पड़ी नयन बान पड़ी नयन बान पड़ी नयन बान पड़ी Mirabai's songs were passed down orally and only appear in written accounts in the early 18th century. There are in fact no surviving manuscripts of her poetry from her century, and according to Stratton Holly, the earliest records of 2 poems credited to her are dated more than 150 years after she died. So while the authenticity of Mirabai's body of work is questionable, the case study of Mirabai opens a window on a key issue that I would like to discuss tonight. And it is how gender ideologies, which are culturally determined, had and still have an effect on music making. I will use Ellen Koskoff's works to provide you with an analytical tool to frame intergender relations in male-oriented cultures, in which a woman's identity is primarily embedded in her sexuality. In her famous work titled Women and Music in Cross-Cultural Perspective, this is not a new work, but is a seminal one, 1987. Ellen Koskov outlined 4 categories of music performance connected with intergender relations as follows. Performance that confirm and maintain the established social sexual arrangement. Performance that appear to maintain established norms in order to protect other, more relevant values. Performances that protest yet maintain the order, and performances that challenge the established order. So I have a question for you. To which of these categories does the case of Mirabai apply? Four? Maybe. I mean, it's a question and everybody has a different answer. I'm not sure that really she challenged in a way, as I already said, she was the first woman breaking certain norms. But on the other hand, also, this exception confirmed the rule, the norm. Anyway, it's an open question. All these categories interact within an existing dichotomy that related to the space of the performance of the private and public spheres of female music activity. In the private domain, we find female gatherings of the private sphere is connected to non-professional activity. So we see religious, folk music, female gatherings like the ones in Zanankana, religious performances like, for instance, Mirabai. And in regard to the religious sphere, Koskov writes something very interesting, and I think it's relevant also for other genres of Sardarni music and San poetry. Koskov says that women's position in many of the world's religions presents a paradox. On the one hand, codified versions of ritual practices often stress a female or feminine principle, one of equal value and weight, acting in harmony with a male counterpart. Yet, despite this conceptual framework, in the vast majority of cases, women's actual involvement in ritual, especially as music specialists, is severely limited, and women's rituals are often described as relegated to the home, or as peripheral to the mainstream. Now, opposite to the private domain, we have the public sphere, professional activity of religious, also in classical music. It's a male domain with an exception. The only exception to this mainstream, male-dominated sphere is that of the courtesans, who were the only performers, professional performers, music specialists, who worked and competed with men in the male-dominated public sphere. They were professional entertainers trained in the art of singing, playing, and dancing. Labeled in Western accounts as courtesans, in the unwritten history of female performers, these women were divided actually in diverse classes of artists, and they had different names. There are different names that were used to refer to them according to the eras and the context in which they lived. Some of these are the Ganikas, Vivadasis, Nainkin, Nachgirls, Calavantin, Lolonis, Domines, Kenchens, Baiji, and tawaifs. One of the first testimonies and terms found in relation to female artists skilled in public performances is actually found in the Kama Sutra in the 4th century of the current era. In this famous treatise on the art of love, Vatsyayana mentions the category of Ganikas, which means singers, Gana, singing. And they had to be skilled in 64 arts. The first art was singing, and for a reason. The other was instrumental music, dance, number 27 playing the veena and the damru. Then they had to master the vocabulary, being poets, and being good in versification and literary forms. In the Kama Sutra, Vatsyayana affirmed that the Ganikas were admired not only for their beauty, but they were respected for being intelligent, knowledgeable, and well-educated women. They also paid taxes and were very wealthy. From Vatsyayana's account, we learn that in the ancient Hindu society predating the Muslim invasion, Ganikas had a place of honor. The term derives from Gana, as I said, singing. Thus, singing, it's an important component of seduction. Sound is an important component of the seduction. The feminine voice articulated in singing and poetry recitation. From a philosophical standpoint, in the Vedic and Tantric traditions, sound, nad, is in fact crucial, as it represents the primary cause in the creation of the world. So, for instance, if you look at this is a quote from a famous music treatise by Matanga Muni, 6th century. There is no Gita, there is no song. There is no swara, there are no musical notes, there is no nrit, there is no dance, and the world does not exist without sound. So sound is is at the beginning, at the creation of the world as manifested. And for instance, this is the Sangeet Ratnakar, 13th century, by Sharangadeva. Nad must manifest the letter constitutes the words make a sentence, the entire business of life is carried through language, and therefore the whole phenomenon of the world is based on sound. So sound is at the origin of the world, but here the sound of a female voice is the media that created an erotic horizon. So my point is that it's not only the female persona, it's not only the body and the beauty of the female singer, but it's also the voice of the female singer that has a power that creates an erotic horizon. No musical information is left about the Ganikas, and we actually don't know about the musical aesthetics, what they sang, what they played. The only courtesans tradition that survived to this day is the repertoire performed by the tawaifs in North India, which includes genres like ghazals, dadra, hori, kajji, and tumri. In northern India, the tawaifs musical tradition flourished during the colonial era, and it ended at the turn of the 20th century with a negative stigma, which was strongly influenced by the Protestant ethos. And this negative mark had a huge impact on all female musical activities, including those that were not at all related to the tawaifs. Only recently the tawaifs culture has been rediscovered for its artistic contribution to Indian music and to Indian history. And this is a topic that cannot be avoided when talking about public performances of sang poetry, even in a broad spectrum. One musical form in which the female voice and aesthetics were strongly represented was tumri, a romantic genre associated, in fact, with the Tawaif tradition. The lyrics in tumri share with the bhakti and classical repertoires the theme of love in the union and in the separation moods, with a substantial difference. Classical and religious songs are often written from a feminine perspective, but performed in public by male artists. Whereas in courtesan songs and in tumri, old-time tumri, the feminine voice of poetry was rendered by a female voice, by a female agency. One of the distinct features of the tumri was the ability of the performer in singing and dancing simultaneously. Thus, the female body movements and the voice not only contributed in creating ambivalence in the message, but could potentially reinforce the worldly nature of love. The performers were in fact expected to entertain a male audience in a secular environment such as a court or a kota. This is actually a kota, while the picture I showed at the beginning was a court. Kota is a music salon run by the tawaifs during restricted mehfils called mujras. While the content of the lyrics may swing between the worldly and mystical interpretations, it was also the context of the performance that shifted the meaning towards a secular understanding. And in her study on Tumri, Lalita Di Perron emphasizes this aspect, this ambiguity of Tumri, which is one of the features of the genre. And from a secular perspective, the lovelorn heroine is voicing the desire to see her lover. From a devotional angle, is actually Radha missing Krishna. So there is no doubt that the ambiguity between worldly and religious moods has pervaded most poetry, including Tumri, and the tension between these two moods can be considered a fundamental component, an inherent component of Tumri, this tension between the mystic love and the worldly love. In contrast with the social norms in which respected women had to cover their faces in order not to meet the eyes of the strangers, eye contact became an essential feature, in fact, a staple of the courtesan songs. In this famous Tumri, Raske pare tore naina, your eyes are full of charm, O Krishna, is Radha talking to Krishna. You can actually see that element of the eyes, or tore naina, of the eyes, the night, the restless night, and the sorrow. This is a famous Tumri that was taught to me by Girija Devi. The first recording was actually by a famous tawaif, and here you see her picture, Kaur Jan, and it's actually also the very first recording of Indian music. Raghav. Rasun ki pare rasun ki pare It's an example of a beautiful poetry. My teacher, Lisa Daly, was actually acknowledged for her immense knowledge of the sign poetry, of oral poetry, and she received actually a doctorate in literature for her immense knowledge. All this, I mean, a large number of songs which are sung poetry were in her mind, and now that she's no more, we do really miss her. Her immense knowledge. The masters are living books, you know, we can record them and document them as much as we can, but really it's a big loss when masters like her pass away. However, going back to our topic, the visual aspect has its raison d'être. The distinct element of the courtesan performance was the singer's beauty, enhanced by the makeup and proper attire. Body movements, gestures, the abhinaya, derived from Kathak, were used to emphasize the meaning of the poetry, reducing the mystical flair of the lyrics. Here, not only the female voice, but definitely it's the body language that verbalizes seduction. And this is a picture of a tawaif performance taken in Benares in 1977. Now, tawaifs have been also celebrated in movies. This is a very famous one. I don't know whether I have the time to play a brief excerpt if you want, but I have something. I think it helps to see the fiction and the reality. After that, I will play something I recorded in Benares from a real person who belongs to the wife family, so you will see the fiction and the reality. They are very different. Okay, let's see if it works. Okay.
What does it take to be a Shenyang dancer? It takes
हुजूर यही है
Very famous movie. enough time, but this is Saya Begum, a woman I discovered in Benares, in the underworld of Benares in the early 2000s, and she belongs to a Tawaif family.
सजना अब घर आ सजना सजना अब घर आ। गाना जो है एक खुशी एक गम।
जी, दोनों
दोनों, क्या खुशी क्या गम, दोनों। कभी अब घर आ खुशी, अब घर आ, अब घर अब घर आ।
The impact of colonial culture, Christian Protestantism in particular, created a long-lasting negative stigma on both performers of secular and spiritual repertoires. But also indigenous reformist movements embraced a tough crusade against the tawaifs mehfils by imposing laws that led to the end of a female musical tradition. Always at the British Library I was able to find some incredible documentation like this one published in Lahore in 1894 by the Punjab Purity Association, and describing the tawaifs as L in her eyes, again the element of the eyes, and her blandishments are all India's ruin. There are several accounts like this. This one, what respectable woman will undertake to dance and sing before the public for remuneration? The Tawaif tradition was completely disrupted after partition. Some singers and dancers found a better fortune in the rising film industry. Others continued their activities in the underworld of big cities like Mumbai, Lucknow, Varanasi, Kolkata, where once the tradition had flourished. It is through this historical framework that we can better understand how a new class of female professional singers of classical and religious music who emerged right before and after 1947 were distinguished by a very strict etiquette on stage, makeup, gestures and movements, facial expressions were absolutely forbidden. I remember my teacher, Srimati Girija Devi, instilling this notion into me during our classes. Born in 1929 into a culture still strongly influenced by the impact of the courtesans tradition on Hindustani music, Girija Devi established a new standard of performance, becoming one of the first female singers to share the same level and command an equal respect with her male peers, always underlining the spiritual aspect of the Tumri, not the worldly aspect. Singers like Girija Devi became an important example to the next generations of female performers. Influenced by colonial thinking and culture, on the one hand, reformist movements caused a cultural shift, which opened new platforms and markets for musicians of every social milieu and genre, especially the middle class. On the other hand, this process entailed a sanitization of genres like Tumri, Dagra, Kadri, that once were the expression of a specific culture. Since the mid-20th century, it has been increasingly clear that a female voice does not necessarily imply a seductive modality. This new awareness has opened new opportunities for women to pursue professional careers in the fields of classical and religious music. Liberated from the stereotypical image of seduction, women had the opportunity to establish themselves on public platforms, often focusing on the spiritual aspect of the poetry to diminish that ambiguity of the text. It is through the lenses of contemporary reading that the songs of Mirabai have been recently rediscovered, and new avenues had also opened for female kirtan performers and Qawwali singers, like for instance Abida Parveen. She really represents an exception, but it's also very interesting what she says about gender. She said, I'm not gendered. When I sit, I'm there. I'm so connected with the Almighty that who cares whether I'm in a female body, whether I feel I am in a female body or not. So I think it's a very, very interesting case study, but especially considering the Sufi Muslim tradition, it's really explains a change, a shift in the culture. The negative stigma born out of the colonial thinking still, however, represents a dark shadow, an unspoken issue also in other contexts not related to the tawaifs culture. I would like to end this lecture, this talk, mentioning an example that I studied over a long-term fieldwork and which also required some reflection because I'm in the Sikh path and I'm a kirtania. So I often pondered about the position of women in the past, in the Sikh culture. In Sikh culture, kirtan is practiced in fact by men and women, and yet the exposure of female professional singers to media is only a recent phenomenon. Only in the early 1980s, female singers emerged on public platforms such as radio, TV shows, and recordings. And the first singer actually appeared on regional TVs in Punjab, Punjabi channel, was Bibi Baljeet Kaur in the mid-1980s. Do I have a minute? You may want to compare with what you have seen so far. It is very important the etiquette also on the stage, along the music, is of course something else. Different context. So this was one of the first performers, female performers, who emerged in a public domain. As of today, the schools in which which young students move their first steps to become ragis, temple performers, are only for boys, and female kirtanias are not yet allowed to sing Bani, the hymns from the Sri Guru Granth Sahib at the Sri Harbans Sahib, the Golden Temple in Amritsar. Ajit Paintal did a fieldwork between 1966 and 1970, and his work provides us with a picture of the kirtan tradition, Gurbani kirtan tradition, during the second half of the 20th century. From Paintal's work, we understand that either the female kirtan practice was not in vogue at that time, or that the scholar did not consider female performances as significant as the renditions of Shabbats done by male singers. So I've been through Paintal's work, and there are only probably 4 or 5 women mentioned among many ragis and rababis. And these women are the wives or the sisters of ragis, or deceased ragis and rababis. So they retain the knowledge, but they are not mentioned as ragis, as performers, in a way. Anyways,
whose work was that?
Ajit Paintal. He was professor at Delhi University, and he's the first scholar who actually did some work on Gurbani Kirtan. So his work was not published. He published, that was his PhD, and he published in 1978 an article. But his PhD was never published, so I went to the Delhi University and I read the whole thing, and I checked all the names. I was looking for women. And women are there, but they're only the sisters or the mothers of ragis. It's not a critique, it's just a picture of the time. So it means that women were not visible on the public platforms and became more visible only after Bibi Banjit Kaur emerged on public channels and Punjabi channels. Only recently some publications acknowledge the names of professional women in the field of Gurbani Kirtan. And things are changing in the field, and it seems that probably soon women will be allowed to sing also at the Sri Harbans Sahib. So things are changing, and we also have to look at the norms that prevented women to sing, Sikh women to sing publicly or professionally. And these are norms that were established during the Sikh Gurus era, the late 15th century, early 18th centuries. And some of these norms were created to protect women. But my point is that while Kirtanya is a spiritual path, and everyone is a Kirtanya potentially, that of a ragi, of a temple performer, is still today a gender profession, which means also performing the asadivar in the morning, performing the wedding, the funeral, certain specific functions. I discussed a lot the matter with Bibi Banjit Kaur and dozens of Sikh women in the Kirtan practice. And for instance, Bibi Banjit Kaur, I asked her whether people address her like a ragi, whether people calls her as a ragi. She said, no, they call me Mahant Kirtanya, big Kirtanya. But that of a ragi is still a gendered profession, although she actually competes with men in the field because she sings asadivar. She's employed and works as a ragi. Anyways, I would like to end this talk with a Gurbani composition. And this is my interviews with Bibi Banjit Kaur. Also, yes, I wanted to mention that now in the field there are, of course, Sikh women from India and from the West, like for instance Ashutrit Kaur Khalsa or Sanatan Kaur, who are very, very famous and very, very popular, for instance, on social media, very active on social media. So this tells about the big shift that happened after 1984, which is very important. But my point today, why was I discussing these different forms, very opposite, is to show how the stigma, the negative stigma about the tawaif culture had a strong impact on classical music and even on something absolutely not related to the tawaif tradition. But believe me, I interviewed many female singers of the old generation, those who were born in the 30s, and those who wanted to sing at that time, but they didn't have the chance to learn classical music, to be educated, because their family were very much against that, because they didn't want their daughters to become mirasi, the wives. So the stigma was there, not now, but in the past was there, and prevented also women to learn music at professional level. I would like to thank you for your attention, and I would like to sing now a hymn from the Guru Granth Sahib. Rag Bihagra, Manla Panjwa, Garduja, Pancham Visavari, 15 beats. And I will use this app, so I would like you to pay attention also to the rhythmic structure of this composition, which is not an easy one, in 15 beats. The words Vada Sukharanariye Priya Premalaga. There's the element of sukh, of pleasure, but this is not the worldly pleasure. This is a mystical, spiritual pleasure, as described by Guru Arjan Dev. So it is definitely the context that matters. Vada Sukharani Priya Vada Sukharani Priya Premalada Vada Sukharani Priya Premalada Gat Dukhani Indriye Panson Sadamudi Vada Sukharani Vada Sukharani Priya Premalada Gat Dukhani gat dukh nindariye pasan sada pada vard sukh Pag dur bacho sada jacho pag dur bacho sada jacho naam ras bairagni naam Bald sukh Priya prem laga Bald sukh Priya prem laga Gat dukh nindariye Pasan sada pada Gat dukh Pasan sada pada vard sukh Gah bhujali prem Gah bhujali prem Milan Pritam Sachmaga Milan Pritam Sachmaga Binavantananak Tarkirpa Binavantananak Tarkirpa Rahachaya Sanglaga Rahachaya Sanglaga Vard sukh Priya prem laga Vard sukh Priya prem laga Gat dukh nindariye Pasan sada pada Gat dukh nindariye Pasan sada pada Vard sukh Vard sukh Priya prem laga Prem laga